firstly, thank you for joining us here on Fuse. It's a delight to have you with us.
Great. Thanks very much. Looking forward to it.
Give us a sense of where you are in the world and what is it that you do?
So I wear a couple of hats. I'm the director of Orchan Consulting Asia, which is a boutique communications agency based out of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, but we service clients regionally. I'm also the principal director of the Third Degree, which is an educational resource platform for postgraduate research. Both companies actually have the same ownership structure, but are treated slightly differently, even though there are overlaps with what we get into.
It's certainly a challenging time, but also a time in which people have taken the opportunity to really start to learn about themselves as individuals and maybe make that assessment that this is an opportunity to look at continuing professional development, further education, higher education for sure. And I know that people have looked at their businesses and what can we do to really focus on the business and invest on in the business. And a lot of that has come to education and supporting education. You've explained about the structure of your organization. And we had some interesting news recently with the change with edX and MOOCs and everything that's just happened with that for a non-profit selling out to a for-profit. It's an interesting marketplace. It's an interesting time, but then we've still got bricks and mortar educational establishments. And from your perspective as someone who is still in that space of lockdown, and hopefully it will be over as soon as it's safe to do so, how are educational establishments dealing with this? How are educational establishments working to continue that stream of inbound students?
Sure. So we've got, some interesting scenarios that are happening. If we look at Australia, for example, Australia lost a significant proportion of its international students. They're still uncertain when the international students are coming back. But 2021 saw an increase in uptake of enrollment of Australian students at universities. So that in itself was an interesting change. Universities themselves and any higher education institute has got to look at what can they do, not only to survive the immediate government policy changes that are happening, but also what they can do to survive the coming 5 years. For some universities, it's obviously been that they say it's the knee-jerk reaction to online education. I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's looking at how do we connect with students that can continue to be involved with us, even though they may not be in the same city. A very key point I'd like to make is a lot of people globally have been criticizing the knee-jerk online teaching and delivery mode of universities. But let's be real. The model of delivery outside of campus is not new. In fact, I taught my first online program for Massey University in New Zealand in, I think, 2001. And it wasn't new then either. But we are at a situation where it is new for 100% of the students, new for 100% of the academics. So we've got to be able to look at, one, how do we keep our relevance as a university or as a higher educational institute? How do we retain our relevance to students that are in our neighborhood, further afield in our country and our region, and also globally? And then the second part is, how do we actually make that happen? There are different models that work. New Zealand universities suffered majorly with respect to lack of access for mainland Chinese students. And that's a a huge proportion of international students. The universities, I recall, clumped together, created learning centers in different parts of China where the students could come in, have local tutors to support, but do online courses. So they would dial into their New Zealand lectures, they would download whatever they needed, and then they'd have physical support in their own country. So universities are getting creative, but in order to make that happen, they've got to maintain that connection with students and prospects.
It's interesting when you look at establishments from the UK. We've got overseas branches or overseas units for Oxford, for Cambridge, for Middlesex, for Southampton, and the such like, and they've proved to be incredibly successful, particularly in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East. Do you think that there's a challenge for establishments to really look at how they're performing and how they're aligning with the needs of students? Because we're also in this situation where the assumption was years and years and years and years ago that you would just go to the local university because it's probably bell curve, that's what you're going to go to. But now with all of this online choice, you could still be around your community, you can still be with your loved ones, you can still be with friends, etc. But you could actually be studying with an Ivy League or an Oxford, a Cambridge, a whatever, this, that, and the other. And maybe that'll help your resume or your CV in the long term because of the backing of that establishment with that level of endorsement once you've gone through it. Because, hey, the university league tables are real, whether they're criticized or embraced. And it tends to be, if you're at the top end of a league table, you'll embrace it. And if you're further down, you'll criticize the methodology. So is that a real thing that universities really do have to look at their programming and their alignment so that they are appealing beyond just capturing geography?
Sure. So there's a couple of things to think about with that. If we look recently what's been happening in global geopolitics, you'll see that there are some issues about alignment of particular universities in particular countries. And I don't want to get into that now, but that's always going to be a potential risk. In real terms, though, it's simply taking your product to a very valued market where there are customers for it. And universities that have gone on a international expansion program have been able to get a foothold for a new regional market, not only for that country, but, for example, if we take a British branch campus in Malaysia, and, we've got a number of universities here. Nottingham, for example, is a very well-known and very popular university here. It's capturing students not only from Malaysia, but you're getting from the region. It's making that education, that quality education, affordable for the students that are in this region who might either have not gone overseas but wanted to, would have gone into maybe a local private university but not really been as fulfilled as a student. But it is indeed opening up their future opportunities because as it comes down to it, as you said, what goes on the CV, especially the tier 1 universities or even the tier 2 universities, really does help to open doors. From a university perspective, it's a great way of being relevant in multiple locations. The university is supposed to be, you can either call it the voice of society or the conscience of society. It's a model, it's a thought that's been around for a long time, but it's usually only that voice or conscience in one little area. And it does have, by opening up elsewhere, it has this opportunity to really enhance research opportunities. It has the opportunity to enhance student pathways because at the end of the day, the top quality students are still being funneled back to the original locale in many cases for postgraduate research. So it has another benefit for the universities as well.
So when it comes to how the universities are going to communicate their offer to different territories, to the very lucrative international students and the families, the parents of the international students, how are these establishments really looking at communicating to actually drive people to their courses, to their offer over others? What is that differentiation, and what are the tactics used to communicate?
I think there is a lot more investment now in maintaining both that online presence for marketing purposes, but also more for research and stakeholder outreach. Looking at seeing what the university can contribute. It's interesting that you mentioned parents. I come from New Zealand. I could never have imagined my parents being involved in the university decision making, even as a 17-year-old when I went to university. That was don't even come to campus. Um, but there, in Asia, in Asia we have a very strong decision making. Um, with the parents. And a lot of the communications that are done, even by the international universities here, are driving the message towards the parents first and the students second. And interestingly enough, I saw a few weeks ago, University of Sydney, looking at domestic students, not even international students, but looking at domestic students, had started a campaign that targeted the parents first as well. So I think there are some fundamental changes happening, recognizing that, if I can't get the students, I need to go to whom is influencing their thought patterns in order to hope to get them in as well. What I like, or what I see that I like, is a lot more open access to the universities who are trying to recruit students internationally. The fact that just because our classes have gone online, etc., that's one side, but the fact that the universities are inviting the students in virtually. They've jumped on board very fast. Even 2021, they jumped on board very fast. Virtual tours, trying to replicate as much of the experience as possible and making sure that the students still feel part of that community, even though they're sitting at home at a laptop screen experiencing the education. So that the universities have gone, I think, very well in trying to embrace and trying to give the American rah, rah, rah sort of feeling about being part of it. But that's translated very well into online communications.
In terms of post pandemic, in terms of getting to the other side of this, the lessons we've learned in that sector, in higher education, when it comes to what does the future hold, do you think that we have got to the point now that maybe it's hybrid learning, maybe it's a case of rolling back to how it was before? Where does the choice for the student really come into it in determining, well, going forwards, I kind of like doing this bit in class, bit remote, getting that flexibility in there? Do you think it's going to change how we work?
I think yes. I think the notion of online access to higher education is certainly staying. I mean, we've got private organizations, Udemy, Coursera, even what I'm doing with the third degree is actually pushing those agendas the micro-credentialing that relates back to universities, makes learning more flexible for students. I think we're here to stay in some form, but it's much like the difference between a physical book and a Kindle. Kindle gets embraced, but nobody's gone out and said, I'm not buying physical books anymore. I think the traditional university is still going to be embraced, but we've now changed the way in which we can reach out to students. And it's no longer an environment where you have that, I don't want to say the 9 to 5 class model, but it is in a way. We're losing that. We're enabling flexibility. We're changing the geographies of outreach. We're changing the sphere of influence that we have from a university perspective. And I think that's just going to drive more students around the world to say, look, I don't have to go to the university down the road because it's convenient. I can spend less money even and go to a university partway across the world and get a qualification. And what's also increasing the last couple of years is jointly awarded qualifications. And that's becoming part of the communications message. I do a lot with doctoral students, and we have started seeing for the first time, or at least first time I've seen it this year, jointly awarded doctoral programs for students. The fact is, you still don't have to be in that country in order to make it happen. So we've opened up opportunities. We're certainly at a pace that we can get it across. One of the other things to think about as well is the issue of technology. Depending on where we are in the world, our access to technology is, of course, different. But the universities are still providing scaled down options in terms of how they can get students in. So, and that's been communicated. So if we look at students in Africa, for example, who can now hook into a British or an American or an Australian degree, even though they're only utilizing mobile phone or they don't have great online streaming capability, but the universities are adapting to that as well. And those are great markets.
What would your message be to educational establishments as to how they really need to be thinking when it comes to communicating towards that international student?
Students, I think, want opportunities that are a little bit different. They want to have, obviously, a value add, but they also live in a competitive world. So the value add has got to be something different to what their neighbors are getting. And for universities, it is really about getting into a little bit more personalization to address some of those issues when reaching out to students. It is about showing them, especially for students from countries that probably aren't as globalized as where we live, but it is about showing them that a global opportunity exists at your fingertips, not because of international travel options. And, communicating more towards where this can lead them to, how it can help them develop a career and a future that, is different from what we thought about 2 or 3 years ago, is actually going to be beneficial, both for the students, dare I say it, for their families, but definitely for the students. But I think it's got the broader influence there as well.
Craig, where can we find out more information about you?
Okay, so I'm available on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/CJ Selby, Selby, and I can be reached on my email, Craig@Orchan, ORCHAN.Asia.
Craig, thank you so much for joining us here on Fuse today.
My pleasure. It's been absolutely awesome. Thank you.